Let's talk about courage and hope. The courage to act when faced with challenges, and the hope that such courage creates. This is what Right Livelihood laureates do every day. This interview presents one of the 4 2022 Right Livelihood laureates and their fight for a better future for all. Let them inspire you. Hope is what we create when we take action together.
Welcome to this interview series with 2022 Right Livelihood laureates. In these 30-minute conversations, we will explore their work and methods and learn more about the motivation behind their commitment. This is How to Mobilise Change, the Courage to Act. And I have the great honor to be joined for this conversation by 2022 Right Livelihood laureate Ilwad Elman, Chief Operating Officer of Elman Peace. So I was hoping we might start by talking about what Elman Peace was when it was first founded by your father in the 90s.
Elman Peace, from the onset, was not an institution, was not an organization, it was a movement that was led by my parents, two ardent peace and social justice warriors. My father was a really disadvantaged young person in Somalia before the war, and an orphan and street child himself. So he had the opportunity, luckily, to study abroad in Italy at a very young age, and then he pursued higher education until he became an electrical engineer in Germany and continued to travel around the world until he finally came back to Somalia because he felt he had an obligation to pay it forward, to create opportunities for other young people in the situation that he wants in himself to also have opportunities. He was a businessman and held businesses across the country and was very successful. He and my mother then always had a social impact element to their work. Their for-profit businesses would create opportunities for youth and children with substance abuse problems and orphans in the streets. And they would train them and give them employment in their businesses. When the war broke out, they shifted their focus to the young people that were being co-opted by the warlords at the time. So from the onset, it was people coming together, using their own resources to try to respond to the ailments of society. And very quickly, that turned from a preventative measure to responding directly to a full-scale war. My mother and father had to make a decision to split up when the war worsened, not knowing that it would be the last time they would see each other. My father would stay behind and continue to fight for peace under a campaign that he started called Drop the Gun, Pick Up the Pen. And my mother would leave Somalia for refuge with my sisters and I. So we left when I was quite young. I was 2 years old. And we went to Kenya and spent a couple years there in the refugee route until we got asylum in Canada. But the spirit of Elman Peace, before the war, during the war, was always about responding to what society needed. Not necessarily campaigning for the things that we are against, but leading with the things that we are for, the things that bring people together. So even in the most difficult of times in Somalia, it was human commonality, the things that bring us together that made the organization or that movement so successful. For example, in 1992, at the beginning of the war in Somalia, where thousands of people were dying, my father was able to host one of the biggest football games in the national stadium, where thousands of people came together, waving white flags. When the entire city was completely dark and there was no electricity, he was able to use his technical skills and actually start an electricity company. It's the same one that we use to this day in Mogadishu, and give free electricity to communities that didn't have any power. knowing that wherever there was darkness, there was more crime, there was more violence, and used light as a means for peace.
Can I ask you to talk about your father's death and the decision made by your family and your mother in the wake of that to go back to Somalia to continue the work?
So my father was campaigning for people to drop the guns, and he was providing alternative dignified livelihoods to thousands of people that were essentially human shields for the warlords, and was so successful at demobilizing and disarming them that he received many, many threats to stop what he was doing. Because one thing that the different warlords all were agreeing on is that he was an impediment to their goals. And they were losing foot soldiers because he was giving people a safer alternative to joining the conflict. After many threats, he was told by family members and people that loved him, that were concerned about him, to have armed escorts himself, to have security guards to protect him. And true to his convictions of not being protected by the gun, he refused any protection and continued his work. And on March 9th, 1996, he was killed by 3 men, and it was considered a political assassination, but to this day, it's not known who exactly killed him. It sent a shockwave around the world because of the hope that he presented in a very dark time in Somalia. And so my mother was with my sisters and I in Kenya at the time, and that meant there was no going back to Somalia. The goal was never to get asylum in Canada. The goal was to one day return to Somalia and hoping that the conflict would subdue. No one thought that the conflict in Somalia would protract for 30 years till this very day. And when my father was killed, she decided that there was no turning back and was able to get support to pursue a better life for my sisters and I. And she has been a fierce custodian of his legacy my whole life. I'm so inspired by her every day. And when I think that by the age of 24, she already had 3 girls. She already lost her husband. She was already a refugee. She was trying to figure out what to do with these 3 young girls that she had in a society that basically ostracized her when she lost a husband that otherwise was wealthy, but she did not have any claim or access to inheritance because she had no boys, and then managed to just pick herself up and do what she needed to do is incredibly encouraging. And then our life in Canada was humble. It was simple, but we were always instilled with purpose. And the fact that she never chose to remarry because she invested all of her time and energy into us and showing us what life could be, and being the embodiment of what true conviction looks like, has been it's been incredible. So she's carried so much strength and grace, and beyond losing my father, she also lost my sister, who was killed. And to continue to wake up every day and fight for peace is it's inspiring. We've always had this unspoken goal in my household, growing up in Canada, of doing great, purposeful, meaningful things. What that meant or what that was never prescribed or defined for us, but purpose was a conversation and topic that was introduced to my life at a very young age. So at the age of 19, I had a bit of a midlife crisis where I felt like I needed to figure out what is this purpose. And it also came at a time when my mother had already left my sisters and I. So my whole upbringing in Canada, my mom always told us that the moment she felt my sisters and I were old enough to take care of ourselves, she was going to go back to Somalia. And for her, the target was my younger sister being in high school. And that's the day that she left. So my younger sister was 14, I was 16, my eldest sister was 18. And as soon as that date came, she went back to Somalia to continue the work that she and my father had started. And so she had been gone for some years then, 3 years already. And I was studying development and globalization, and I was interested in the sector. I knew the sacrifices my family had made for others and in the humanitarian world, but the two worlds weren't connecting. That was further compounded by really feeling worried for her. We'd lose contact with her for weeks at a time while she was in Somalia, and the only depiction of Somalia we saw was on mainstream media, and you'd see bombings, and you'd see famine and insecurity, but it was just so far removed. So to appease my own heart, I decided to go to Somalia to better understand why she was there. And I understood immediately, the same way that we needed her, hundreds of others needed her as well too. Well, as soon as I went to Somalia as well too, and the reason why I was able to stay is because I saw that the majority of people that she was working with were children and youth, and from very different backgrounds. Young people that have come from armed groups, girls that are survivors of terrible violence, but it was such a young population. It was like a young village, and she was the mother in the middle of all of it. And there was a lot of programs that were happening, and it was very small scale, but it was so positive in a very dark time. And that's the image that stands out to me from that time. But we've since grown across the country, where at that time where she had one main office in Mogadishu, we now have physical presence and offices throughout the entire country. And we have programs that support hundreds of people in each location. So from a geographic scope, for the number of people that we can reach, we've expanded, but the spirit hasn't changed. And each community that we work in, it's still positive, it's still accessible, it's still friendly and homey. And I think that really much is inspired by her visionary leadership. We are just a stop on someone's journey, hopefully to be able to rebuild and reclaim their lives in the absence of those services being available. And I think it's important that the way that we are viewed, which I think is one of our biggest successes as well too, is as a partner to our community. We share the same hardships. We are, sometimes to our own detriment, incredibly accessible and open in a society that is increasingly polarized and closed and fearful of each other. But we do so to be able to meet the needs of our community. And our goal has never been to scale and expand and grow, and even though now we're working outside of Somalia and other new and emerging conflicts as well too, it's never been an institutional journey of growing, but to stick to our roots of how Elman Peace was started, which is caring people, doing things for their community. Despite the long road ahead that still lies for us in creating a free and just and safe world for women and girls in Somalia, the conversation around sexual and gender-based violence that we've been able to generate that never really before existed, and the work and the subsequent service delivery that is now being led by many different organizations, is one of the things that I can point to quite tangibly in Somalia as real change that is measurable and gives us hope that advocacy actually works. And in just a short period of 11 years, the landscape has completely changed in Somalia. When we opened our first rape crisis center, it coincided with a humanitarian crisis and a terrible drought. More than 350,000 people died. It was mostly women with children in tow that were coming from all of the different regions to Mogadishu in desperate search of food and aid and support. But they were in these internally displaced people's camps and had no protection. And every night there were military convoys parked outside of these camps, either stealing their food and the rations that they were getting, or were being indiscriminately raped. And we, as human rights defenders, were monitoring and documenting and reporting the violations that were happening, but we realized there weren't any services that we could refer the women and girls to. There wasn't any clinical management of rape. Post-exposure prophylaxis and PEP kits to treat survivors of rape where it was not even available in the country. So we started to, pull our resources together, create alliances with different activists, and with humble $5,000 that we were able to raise with people that we crowdsourced from around the world, we were able to set up a small office that doubled as a safe house, and we saw a foot traffic of more than 30 people a day that we were supporting, where our human rights monitors actually now had a facility to refer people to. We had to import the PEP kits, and then also started to do advocacy on the issue. Survivors started to speak out. Journalists started to cover the issue. Rapists were never tried, but survivors and journalists covering the story were prosecuted and jailed. Our centers were shut down. Our staff were harassed. The president at the time actually held a press conference and said that rape does not happen in Somalia. It is a fabrication, and any organization who's speaking about this is trying to defame us and our culture and our country. Fast forward to now, where we have the First Minister of Women and Human Rights. We have a growing legal framework. We had a sexual offenses bill that was adopted in 2018 that now actually recognizes rape as a crime. We make it a point to access newly recovered territories. Mm-hmm. So as soon as a military operation happens and an area is cleared, we make sure that even if they're mobile services at that time, that there is support available. So we move as fast as the security operations move as well too, until we can find resources to set up something more permanent. But our approach is always working with local community, working with traditional birth attendants, with thought leaders, with religious leaders, and really embedding ourselves within the community from the onset, recognizing that funding is not forever, that once we start a service in a community that has been historically deprived of such services, that we don't have the opportunity of just leaving. So we already begin to think about what does it look like in 2 years? What is the private sector that's in place there that could help us with some of the costs if we don't have donor funding anymore? And this strategy helps us to also develop sustainable interventions in the communities that we engage in. One picked up a weapon and joined a group like ISIS or Al-Shabaab in Somalia, and one didn't. Same socioeconomic background, same livelihood, same family makeup. What was the final tipping point? Mm-hmm. And an overwhelming majority of the respondents that we interviewed said the final tipping point for them wasn't some big scary sheikh that was brainwashing them, but it was government action. It was militarization. It was oppression. It was human rights violations, impunity. So when we look at that statistic and the empirical evidence that supports that, and also looking at the majority of those that join extremist groups have least religious knowledge, then we don't have to focus so much on de-radicalization, but looking at the other underlying grievances. So there's an intentional exploitation and targeting and recruitment of them, and that's why we receive and support so many. We have advocated with the government to release any child that is captured or surrenders to the front line. And now we have this agreement in place that they do so within 72 hours. And that's how one way that we receive them. The other is young people that have gone through our program now becoming ambassadors of it and reaching out to their peers and being credible actors and real-life examples of what life can look like on the other side. So that referral is the way that we receive them. And the third being through community networks.
How do you feel what do you feel the relationship is between your work protecting survivors of gender-based violence and the work with, youth who have been targeted by extremist organizations?
They're interlinked as well too. I mean, there are girls that have been combatants. There are girls who have been forced into marriage or have been sex slaves. The gendered roles within armed groups, not only with extremist organizations, but also within the ranks of the National Armed Forces, are horrific as well too. So the two issues are intersecting very much.
How did it feel to receive the Right Livelihood Award?
An incredible honor to receive the Right Livelihood Award. It was a beautiful surprise and an overwhelming announcement, and very encouraging for myself, and I know I can say so on behalf of my mother as well too. And it was a beautiful recognition for our entire team to be seen by the world, for our work to be a source of inspiration to others, but also to join this incredible family of laureates that are so accomplished and fearless, that have been receiving this award for decades. So our work has always intentionally been one foot in the local, but one in the global. So we know that we have to influence foreign policy and global, human rights, and make sure that the voices of people in Somalia and the issues that are happening are also on the international agenda, because that also dictates the type of support and political interventions that happen in our country.
What do you think the next fight is?
There's been another terrible explosion that happened in Mogadishu where civilians lost their lives, and this is a setback, but I do believe that the peace that we've been fighting for all these years is within reach now more than ever before. So the next fight is really trying to invest more in social peace as opposed to just political peace. We have been looking at how do we abandon this global obsession with this proverbial peace agreement table. How do we move beyond just bringing the political elites together to put ink on paper and then declare the end of a war, but look at engaging other actors and having a whole of society and inclusive process to peace? And that's what our work has been yielding at very micro district levels, looking at transitional justice and reconciliation, and we've been seeing impact that could be taken to scale. So our next fight is bringing that to scale, and I think now, more than ever, when there are 56 active armed conflicts in the world today, that these are lessons that we need to take on, that we can see that political peace is necessary, but social peace is more tangible and immediate.
How do you, when there are setbacks and moments of trauma and disappointment, how do you find resilience in yourself?
In a context like Somalia, where there is no PTSD, there's no post, because we're constantly in a state of cyclical trauma and trying to cope and survive and keep going, and we mask survival as resilience. As opposed to looking at coping strategies. And that has led me and my work and the Elman Peace to explore alternative methods to trauma healing, especially in a context where traditional approaches to therapy are considered weak, or it's considered being ungrateful. Like, how dare you speak about the trauma that you should feel so grateful to have overcome? And so even in our work with survivors of sexual and gender-based violence, with children that are leaving armed groups, we constantly try to apply an element of psychosocial support and counseling, and we keep hitting this roadblock because everyone is too proud to speak about what they've gone through. And that led us down a journey of exploring alternative methods. And we saw how surf therapy helped war veterans in the US, and it was used in Northern Ireland and with youth that are in gangs in the townships in South Africa. And we started to explore that and adopt it, and we saw that there's a potential in treating the somatic symptoms of trauma through communal healing and movement-based therapy. And that led us down a journey of looking at yoga, art therapy, expression, and all of these elements are much more accepted in Somali community. And we found that even for frontline actors like myself that are constantly receiving secondary trauma or first-hand trauma by virtue of being in the community that they are supporting, they need that outlet as well too.
Which of the various kind of, non-traditional therapies that you guys have developed is your personal favorite?
Surfing. Surfing is my favorite, and I'm terrible at surfing, but it's the process of it. And the youth in our programs love surfing as well too, because for many of them, this is the first time they've ever surfed. In Somalia, the population is 78% of the population is under the age of 30. 56% of that is 16 and under. And the country's been in conflict for 30 years. So this nation, essentially of children, has only ever known war. And we don't have a Somali word for surfing. They call it surfing ka. You just add a ka and it becomes a Somali word, but they've seen it in movies, so they're very excited to try it. But we're working with youth that are coming from different backgrounds, from different affiliations. They wouldn't usually play together. So I like the surfing activity because it's not only useful for the individual in exercising patience, trust, and really listening and following to instructions, but it also creates trust between youth that otherwise would engage with each other.